What was the most racist rule at your school? The nurse said it was a panic attack and asked if I wanted to call someone to help me calm down. I sat there shaking, too scared to speak Spanish even to make myself feel better. They made me afraid of my own voice, afraid of the words that lived in my throat since I was born. That evening after Mom got home from work, Ruben called our house and spent an hour walking us through our options. He kept saying we should send a formal notice to the district's legal counsel about Title VI violations, which had something to do with discrimination based on national origin. He typed up a draft while we were on the phone, reading parts out loud so we could understand what we were signing. The legal words made my head hurt, but Mom nodded along, taking notes on the back of an envelope. Ruben warned us that going to the media might make things worse because the school could dig in harder just to prove they weren't backing down. Every choice felt like it could blow up in our faces. The district sent their response to my interpreter request the next morning. 3 paragraphs of nothing wrapped in fancy words. They said they'd review the policy but couldn't provide an interpreter for tomorrow's hearing, which was basically their way of saying tough luck. I went through the email with a highlighter, marking every vague phrase that didn't actually promise anything. The whole thing felt designed to wear people down until they gave up fighting. I spent that whole afternoon practicing my statement for the hearing, recording myself on my phone over and over. The medical terms kept coming out in Spanish first because that's how I'd learned them from helping my grandmother with her prescriptions. I had to force myself to say cardiac medication instead of medicina cardiaca, and my tongue felt thick and clumsy. My own mouth felt like it was betraying me, refusing to cooperate when I needed it most. The morning before the hearing, I checked my email to find a message from the hospital with an attachment. The doctor who treated my grandmother had written a brief letter on official hospital letterhead stating that my translation had prevented a potentially fatal medication error. Seeing it written out with his signature at the bottom made it real in a way that nothing else had. This piece of paper proved I'd saved her life, and holding it felt like putting on armor before a battle. During lunch, I met with a classmate I trusted to go over the anonymous statements from other families. Parents had written about their kids getting suspended for answering their phones in their native language, about missing important family news because they were too scared to take calls at the school. We practiced reading them out loud, keeping our voices steady and our faces neutral so nobody could guess whose stories these were. Building this small network of people willing to help felt like we were building something bigger than just my case. Orlando called that afternoon to suggest copying the district equity officer on all the hearing materials. He said creating an official record beyond just the school would matter if this went further, which seemed to mean if we had to sue. I spent an hour scanning every document, every email, every piece of paper that showed what had happened. The stack of evidence kept growing thicker, each page another piece of proof that this wasn't just about me. Mike Fair showed up at my house that evening with what he called a final offer. If I signed a paper agreeing not to discuss the policy publicly, they'd reduce my punishment to just detention instead of suspension. The paper sat on our kitchen table while he explained how this would make everything go away, how I could move on without any permanent mark on my record. For a second I almost reached for the pen because I was so tired of fighting, but signing would mean staying quiet while other kids kept suffering. I told him no thank you and watched him fold the paper back into his briefcase with a disappointed look. My phone started blowing up with messages from other students who'd heard about the hearing and wanted to organize a walkout to support me. They were ready to risk their own futures to stand up for what was right, but I couldn't let them do that. I sent message after message asking them not to risk suspension or losing scholarships because of me. This was my fight to finish, and I wouldn't drag anyone else down with me. That night my grandmother sat with me in the kitchen, not really understanding why everyone was so upset, but knowing something big was happening. She told me in Spanish to speak the truth tomorrow, even if it cost me everything. That truth was more important than their rules. I wrote her words down in English on an index card to read at the hearing, her voice giving me strength even in translation. Family mattered more than any policy they could make up. The next morning I stood in the same bathroom stall where I used to tap out codes to avoid speaking Spanish, where I'd hidden so many times to protect myself from their rules. Looking at myself in the scratched mirror above the sink, I decided I was done hiding who I was. Tomorrow at the hearing I would speak clearly in English about why both languages made me whole, why taking away half my voice was like cutting out half my heart. The decision brought a strange calm, like finally putting down something heavy I'd been carrying for too long. The morning came too fast with my alarm going off at 6:30. I texted Orlando to confirm he was still coming and got back a thumbs up emoji. My hands shook while I made coffee and tried to eat toast that tasted like cardboard. The stack of papers I'd printed sat on the kitchen table next to the hospital letter and the anonymous statements from other families. Mom came out of her room already dressed in her best work clothes, the ones she saved for parent-teacher conferences. She looked at the papers and nodded, then started making eggs, even though neither of us felt like eating. Orlando showed up at 7:45 wearing a button-down shirt I'd never seen him in before. We went over the plan one more time while Mom listened and asked questions about who would be there. I explained about Mike Fair being the student advocate and how the district would send someone too. Orlando practiced saying medical terms in English in case he needed to help translate anything important. My phone rang while we were reviewing and I saw it was my neighbor calling. She needed to know if my grandmother should take her morning medication with food or without. I explained in clear English that the white pills went with breakfast, but the pink one was for bedtime. The words came out smooth and easy when I wasn't worried about someone listening and judging every syllable. After I hung up, Orlando pointed out how different I sounded when I wasn't scared of getting in trouble. Mom squeezed my shoulder and we gathered up all the papers. I made 2 copies of everything in case they tried to keep the originals. The walk to the school felt longer than usual with Mom beside me and Orlando trailing behind. Other kids stared as we passed, but I kept my eyes forward. The main office secretary looked surprised to see us and pointed toward the conference room down the hall. The door was already open and I could see the long table set up inside. Principal Harris sat at the head with his laptop open and a stack of folders beside him. Mike Fair was to his left with a yellow legal pad and pen. A woman I didn't recognize sat across from Mike with a district badge on her lanyard. The teacher representative turned out to be my sophomore English teacher, who gave me a small nod when we walked in. There was no interpreter, even though I'd requested one in my grievance paperwork. Orlando took the chair behind me while Mom sat to my right. The room smelled like coffee and copy paper. Principal Harris didn't look up from his laptop for a full minute after we sat down. When he finally did, his face was completely neutral, like we were discussing attendance numbers instead of my future. He turned the laptop screen toward me and hit play on the security footage. The hallway video showed me running while talking on my phone, my mouth moving fast as I switched between languages. The audio was clear enough to hear every Spanish word I'd said to my neighbor and the paramedics. He let it play for 3 minutes before stopping it and pulling out a suspension form with my name already typed at the top. He stated that the evidence clearly showed willful defiance of school policy regarding English-only communication on the school property. I kept my voice steady and confirmed that yes, I had spoken Spanish in the hallway that day. I explained about my grandmother's heart condition and the medication mix-up and how the paramedics needed exact information to save her life. My hands were shaking under the table, but I kept them flat against my thighs. Principal Harris wrote something on his form while I talked. I pulled out the hospital letter and slid it across the table toward the district representative. She picked it up and read it carefully while Principal Harris said the letter didn't change the fact that I'd broken a clearly stated rule. He said policies existed for a reason and making exceptions would undermine the entire system. The district woman asked to keep the letter and made her own notes on a tablet. I handed her the stack of anonymous statements from Vietnamese and Haitian families describing how the rule affected them. The way she practices saying cardiac medication instead of medicina cardiaca shows how our brains store different kinds of knowledge in different languages. How does forcing someone to translate medical terms they learned in Spanish actually help anyone? One family had missed a funeral because they couldn't coordinate childcare without being able to speak their language. Another had a child who wet himself because he was afraid to ask for the bathroom in Vietnamese when he forgot the English word. The district woman's eyebrows went up as she read through them. Principal Harris's jaw got tighter with each page she turned. Mike Fair asked if I had any additional documentation, and I pulled out screenshots screenshots of the state education codes about language access. Mom's phone rang and she fumbled to answer it on speaker when Mike suggested she could provide context about our family situation. Her English came out choppy as she tried to explain about working at the warehouse and my grandmother living with us. When she got stuck on a word, Orlando leaned forward and whispered it to me, and I repeated it louder so everyone could hear. Mom talked about missing school events because teachers made fun of her accent and how she worried every day about me getting suspended for helping with my grandmother. Her voice cracked when she said she was proud of me for saving my grandmother, even if it meant getting in trouble. The district woman typed faster while Mom talked. Mike Fair cleared his throat and suggested that if I withdrew my district grievance, they could reduce the suspension to just 1 day instead of 3. I shook my head and said I wanted the policy reviewed instead of any deals about punishment. I kept my tone respectful, but didn't back down when he pressed about being reasonable. Principal Harris said I was being deliberately difficult and that actions had consequences. The district woman looked between Principal Harris and Mike Fair before saying she thought any disciplinary decision should wait until the district could review its language access policies more thoroughly. Principal Harris's face turned red as he insisted that school-level decisions didn't require district approval for standard disciplinary actions. The district woman reminded him that civil rights complaints went through different channels than regular discipline issues. They went back and forth using careful professional language while my fate hung in the air between them. After another hour of back and forth, they finally reached their decision. The district woman typed something on her laptop while Principal Harris sat there with his arms crossed looking mad. She turned the screen toward me showing the official ruling that I'd get 1 day of in-school suspension starting tomorrow. My record would be flagged as under review and the district would look into their interpreter policies for emergency situations. It wasn't winning or losing, but something in between that nobody was happy about. I signed the paper without saying anything because there was nothing left to say. The next morning I reported to the small room near the main office where they kept suspended kids. The room had 3 desks facing the wall and no windows. I sat there doing worksheets while missing my chemistry lab where we were supposed to be doing the titration experiment that counted for 10% of our grade. My teacher had already said there were no makeup labs allowed, so my grade dropped from an A to a B just like that. During lunch, I ate alone in that room while the monitor watched me from her desk. Some kids walked by the door on their way to the cafeteria, and I saw a few nod at me through the small window, but others were whispering and pointing. One girl mouthed that I got off easy, while another shook her head like I'd caused too much trouble for nothing. The social cost was becoming clear as I sat there with my sandwich getting soggy. That evening, I went straight to my grandmother's room, where she was sitting in her chair watching her Spanish soap opera. She asked me about school, but I just told her it was fine, and sat next to her on the floor leaning against her chair. We watched the show together without talking about what happened at the hearing, because she didn't need to know what speaking Spanish cost me at that school. She ran her fingers through my hair like she used to when I was little, and we shared that quiet comfort without needing any words at all. 3 days later, I got an email forwarded from my mom that the district had sent to all staff about starting a limited inquiry into language access practices at schools. Walking through the hallways that week felt different, because conversations would stop when I passed, and some teachers seemed nervous when they saw me like they were worried I might report them for something. My English teacher, who used to joke around with me now, kept our interactions strictly professional. Being right about the policy didn't mean being welcome in the building anymore. 2 weeks after the hearing, a memo went out announcing an emergency exception for language use during medical or safety situations, and requiring schools to honor interpreter requests for parent meetings. Principal Harris called an assembly to explain that the new rules only applied to documented emergencies, and regular school communication still had to be in English. He stood at the podium reading from the memo in the most narrow way possible, but it was still progress, even if it was small. The scholarship committee sent me a letter saying they were deferring their decision until my final record status was clear, which left me stuck, not knowing if I'd have money for college or not. I wrote them careful updates every week talking about my grades and activities, without mentioning the suspension directly, but focusing on my academic performance while the review continued. Waiting for their answer became its own kind of punishment because I couldn't make any college plans without knowing if I had that scholarship. I submitted an op-ed to the school paper about what it felt like to walk around half-voiced without being able to speak your native language. I described the feeling of words getting stuck in your throat and having to translate your thoughts before speaking them without naming anyone specific or mentioning the suspension. After it got published, other kids started coming up to me quietly saying it captured exactly what they felt too. The Vietnamese kid from my math class showed me where he'd highlighted parts that matched his experience, and the Haitian girl from band said she'd sent it to her parents. Words on paper felt safer than words in hallways where someone might report you. The last week of school, I passed Principal Harris in the hall on my way to history class. We didn't acknowledge each other, but I didn't look away either, and neither did he. I kept walking to class, still careful with my words, but no longer silent about things that mattered. The fight wasn't over, but I was still standing, and sometimes that's enough to keep the small resistance going. Thanks for letting me explore all these questions with you today. It's been really interesting wondering about things together. Until next time, like the video.